Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I do hope you're doing marvellously well and that you're having a very relaxing day. But before we get started, loads of love to each and every one of you. And don't forget to go and get that quintessential perfect drink, whatever it is that you enjoy drinking, because I've got a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it wasn't an easy job, as I began stripping back the old Victorian wallpaper with my large scraper, and it curled back like long strips of skin and fell past my ladder to the ground below, rather reminding me of a pleasurable sun-kissed summer holiday with my husband and I that we'd enjoyed together by the seaside, where he burnt so badly from overexposure to the sun, as his fair skin meant his sun tolerance was very low. I remember I had peeled back the skin on his body, and it was so thin and translucent when you lifted it up to the light. It was quite fascinating, really, and oddly satisfying for me. I seemed to be getting the same kind of warped pleasure out of pulling back the old wallpaper with its oppressive deep burgundy design. I'd always thoroughly enjoyed popping pimples as a teenager and squeezing blackheads, and my sister complained that a small scar on her lower chin was a result of me brutally attacking one of her pimples with such a determined zealousness and enthusiasm that I'd left an indelible mark on her for life. She wasn't adverse to showing her friends what I had done viciously to her skin, and that included every single visitor that frequented our home. Growing up, all her friends gave me a wide, wary girth, as if they suspiciously suspected that I was going to chase them down, pounce on them, and perform mass blackhead extractions on them. My husband and I had recently bought this enchanting, magnificent farmhouse in the heart of the idyllic Kentucky countryside. It was called the Owl's Nest, but sadly it was so incredibly dated. Stuck in a time warp, it looked like the previous owner simply loved everything Victorian. I would have understood it if the house was an old Victorian home, as then the decor would align perfectly and be complementary to the architecture of the house. Our farmhouse was possibly built in the 1980s and was more modern than it was historic. It was charming, though, with a magical, whimsical character all of its own, and a very beguiling allure that was hard to resist. In my opinion, houses are very much like people, with different personalities. You either like them, hate them, or remain dispassionate and indifferent towards them. On this particular day, as we drove through the large wooden gate, signposted the Owl's Nest, and drove down the windy white gravel driveway that hugged the rough ground beneath her, as if in some way they were entwined together like the roots of a tree, driving towards the house. I had fallen in love, as I could feel the quickening of my pulse and the butterflies in my stomach that sent waves of electricity darting over my body in blissful, euphoric shooting spasms. I fancied that I had to have this house, come hell or high water, even if it meant chaining myself to the front door and simply refusing to shift. I'm not sure why, but the house took my breath away. She stood there elegantly, in the middle of a sumptuous emerald green valley, looking like a bedazzling woman with a warm, welcoming and congenial bright smile that seemed impossible to erase. I could sense whether rain, sun, hail or snow, the house would portray that joyful, uplifting and airy energy. I do remember it had been a particularly pretty spring morning, and the shafts of sunlight had enveloped her crisp white walls in an ethereal light, making her look like a glistening pearl, and some of her bright white walls glittered with a golden glaze that gave them a luminescent lustre. It would seem that the simple, symmetrical box-shaped white-painted brick farmhouse with its green slate roof, along with a perfect row of pale green framed windows and matching shutters, had simply won over my heart. Then there was a sweeping white painted wooden deck that followed the contours of the house seamlessly, providing substantial areas for al fresco dining and entertainment, overlooking exquisite panoramic views. And those views, don't let me get started about them. Our house was quite literally framed by acres and acres of undulating verdant countryside, pretty flowery meadows, red barns, stables, outbuildings, and everything was in reasonably good condition. The creme de la creme for me was a pretty sanctuary, a delightful private oasis, secret garden, a hideaway, or room if you like, of its own, all that was home to a glistening silvery pond, fringed by curvaceous sweeping willows that surrounded it like sizable voluptuous women from a Renaissance painting. Its sparkling silvery surface was covered in water lilies that seemed to float like pink stars. Then, to the rear of the pond, was a grove of trees that stretched back for many miles, consisting of statuesque red maples, oaks, and spruce trees. I still remember us pulling into the carport and parking our white Honda Accord. My husband shut down the engine, glancing over at me with a rather bewildered expression upon his face. "Are you all right, Emma? You haven't said a word since we drove down the driveway. Don't you like the look of the farmhouse? I thought it would be right up your alley. Did I get it horribly wrong?" he asked me, looking very befuddled. "I was so sure this was the sort of farmhouse you were looking for." I looked at him with dewy eyes. "I'm too stunned to speak," I said. "I think I've fallen in love. Sorry, sweetheart," I teased. "You've got serious competition. This house is drop-dead gorgeous." We could see the businesslike, rather barrel-shaped estate agent wearing a rather tight navy blue suit that made her look like a sausage bursting out of the seams. She was hurrying out of the black front door, her body bouncing up and down as she jiggled towards us. She was determined. Her resolute beady eyes revealed an impatient eagerness that she failed to disguise. I could perceive by her determined, hungry expression that her mind was racing through the sales techniques she intended to use on us, and her ambitions were so blazingly obvious that she had about as much subtlety as a rhinoceros. This woman could see her next big fat commission check smiling down at her already. I nudged my husband quickly. "Donovan," I said, "I have to have this house. Please put an offer in right now. We haven't got any time to lose," I said, as I started to visualize hundreds of people determined to buy this house, and that just couldn't happen. "Donovan," I said, "I'm begging you, don't play games by reducing the price on this property. Give the sellers exactly what they're asking for. Then we'll settle. This is a house you can't negotiate over. Trust me on this. All too often, if you play hardball, you end up losing the very house you want. We can't lose this house," I said. "We just can't." "But, sweetheart," he had protested, "don't you think you should look inside the property first, before you make such a rash decision like this?" "I want it," I protested. "I don't need to see the insides. I've made up my mind. You need to put the offer in right now." I said this in a very demanding tone. I was never normally this pushy or insistent, and have usually been accused of being too easygoing and laid back. So my husband knew that I meant business. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. DuPont. So good to meet you both," said the estate agent, shaking our hands firmly. "Now I need to warn you, the house inside is a little dated. The previous owner was rather besotted by the Victorian era and—" "We want the house," said my husband. "Could you put an offer in to the owner right now? We will be offering the asking price. I appreciate it." "But Mr. DuPont," said the estate agent, looking at my husband with an astonished look on her face, "you haven't seen the inside of the house yet. It might need a little work on it, and the decor is very dated. You've not seen the outbuildings or the stables yet. Should you not check them first?" "That won't be necessary," said my husband. "We want the Owl's Nest property, and that is that." I remember the estate agent beginning to giggle and say, "Mr. DuPont, how I wish all my buyers were like you. Then my job would be an absolute buzz." Of course, the inside of the house required work, a lot of work, but that was where I arose to the occasion with my illustrious background in interior design, and an excellent pair of inspirational, savvy hands that were fast and efficient with a natural artistic creativity. I had years of experience behind me in helping people turn a sow's ear of a home into a silk purse. The interior of our delightful farmhouse was very open plan, but a few pivotal adjustments needed to be made here and there, nips and tucks if you like a seamstress would apply to a dress, which is what I invariably did to the house, and it was beginning to look quite sensational, even if I say so myself. I could hear the sound of a car sweeping up our white gravel driveway as the wheels scrunched the pebbles. I thought it might be the postman in his van throwing some letters through our letterbox, but he was usually quite noisy. I waited to hear the thump of the post hitting the floor, but it was a long time coming. Instead, I heard a car door slam and reluctant footsteps approach our front door, almost as if the stranger wasn't sure whether to cross our threshold or not. I could hear 3 knocks. Oh no, I thought. I didn't want to answer the door wearing dungarees with pieces of wallpaper scattered over me like dandruff. Worse still, my hair looked like I'd been dragged through a hedge backwards, and I'd lost sight of my hairbrush. I heard the knock again, and so I ventured down the stairs towards the door. A young girl with long blonde hair and fair skin was standing there. At a guess, I would have put her at being about 16 years old. I think she looked heartily relieved to see me, as I was so dishevelled I would have made a self-conscious porcupine feel relaxed. "Hello," I said, looking at the young girl rather awkwardly. "Would you like to come in? I could rustle you up a cup of coffee if you like. But please excuse my appearance. I know I look dreadful, but I'm in the middle of redecorating. I look as if I'm completely covered with dandruff." "You look fine," said the girl, with a glint in her eyes. "A coffee would be very nice," she said. "I'm Emma, by the way," I said. "Oh, and I'm Jolene," she said. "Very pleased to finally meet you." I beckoned for the young girl to take a seat, while I proceeded to boil the kettle. "I used to live here at the Owl's Nest, you know, with the previous owners of this house. They are my foster parents." "Oh, that's fascinating," I said. "So you used to live here?" "That's right," she said, pursing her lips rather awkwardly. "If Mrs. Ward, my foster mother, even knew I was here, she'd probably have a cadenza on the spot. But I knew I needed to warn you. I couldn't live with myself otherwise if I didn't do that. And that would not be fair to you either." A cold shudder went over my body like an icy wind, and my heart sank like the sun slipping behind the horizon and dipping in the valley. I didn't want to hear what Jolene had to say. I was living the perfect dream, and wasn't desirous for that dream to be shattered by bad news into a million shards like a broken mirror. What was she going to tell me, I wondered, holding my breath ever so tightly in my chest. I daren't breathe, not yet anyway, until it was safe to do so. What on earth was she going to reveal to me? Part of me was eager to erect barricades and high fences over my ears, to cut off the entry points of the toxic words that, like poisonous chemicals, could erode my joy in an instant, or like a thief in the night, rob me of my greatest material treasure, this quintessential home of mine. Was our house haunted, I wondered in horror? Or perhaps located near an Indian burial ground? Please, no. I couldn't abide that. Not when all my hopes about our future were pinned to the very foundations of a farmhouse I was eager to call our forever home. "Well," said Jolene gingerly, her fingers trembling as she sipped the coffee from her mug, "our family was having some problems with Bigfoot activity on the land, which was why we sold the Owl's Nest in the first place. It was all desperately sad and unfortunate. I thought you should know. We were sworn to secrecy by Mrs. Ward and her husband, as they were petrified that this farmhouse would not sell if the new owners found out about the potential Bigfoot problem, so everything was hushed and covered up." I was astonished. "Is this some kind of a wind-up?" I asked, "because it's not even remotely funny. Are you kidding?" "Don't be ridiculous. There's no such creature as Bigfoot. Isn't he all part of spurious pulp fiction and urban legend?" "It's not pulp fiction," said the girl. "Hands on heart. Bigfoot is real. I know, because I've seen them myself and played with the youngsters. I think it's the tall, gawky twin Thumper who's responsible for Hugh's death. I'd actually put money on it. I believe it was just a terrible accident, if that makes you feel any better. I know he didn't kill Hugh intentionally, but he seems to be blindly oblivious of his own strength and gets quite heavy-handed with stuff. He doesn't mean any harm by it, but he's rather rambunctious, mischievous and untamed. Rather like a bull in a china shop, I suppose. You're talking way ahead of me, Jolene, I said apologetically. Who is Hugh? What happened to him? And who are the twins? And how many Bigfoots are on our land? Could we start there? Well, I think there are about 8 Bigfoots, said Jolene, although I can't be sure about that. But I do think it's an extended family. But the adults, you don't have to worry about them at all. They're very benevolent, benign and evasive. It's a tall juvenile twin Thumper. He's the one you need to worry about. He's your problem. As I said, he means no harm, but he's impulsive and very headstrong. I tell you what, supposing I believe that everything you're saying is true, just hypothetically, why don't you start from the very beginning? Like when you discovered that there were Bigfoots here at the Owl's Nest, I asked. The very beginning of your story. Well, the Bigfoots aren't always here, admitted Jolene. They come and go like gypsies. I think they're travellers, but as long as the Wards have lived on this land, they've seen them from time to time, gathering apples from the orchard or picking wild berries from the briars. At first we thought they were black bears, but then we soon realised that the creatures were Bigfoots. They had human-like faces. They were intimidating, very scary, like apex predators, but in our experience they genuinely don't like to be seen. But when we had encountered them, they have been harmless, congenial and benign, and have always glided back into the woods. They've never been a threat to us, nor have they caused us any problems, so we've left them well alone. We've often heard chattering in the woods, and that's them talking together. They speak very fast in a strange, rather peculiar language, using lots of clicks. When they're really happy, they whoop or whistle, and their calls can be heard from miles around. If they're upset, they scream, and that is a blood-curdling sound that you really don't want to hear. It makes your skin crawl. Well, it does mine. It sounds so terrifying. If you ever hear that sounds like a woman is being murdered, it's not a woman being murdered. It's probably a large male throwing a hissy fit and having an explosive tantrum that they want everyone to know about. The female Bigfoot are far less temperamental, more grounded, circumspect and pragmatic, and they usually rule the roost in the family, unless you have a belligerent male in charge who uses his size to intimidate the females. One of the Bigfoot mothers gave birth to 2 twin boys a while back, and they almost look identical, except one is significantly taller than the other. That's the one you need to watch. When they were big enough, they started to interact with Hugh and I, and they were great fun to play with. It's the tall, lumbering one, as I keep saying, the ungainly twin, who's a clumsy oaf with very bad hand-to-eye coordination. He's prone to getting into all kinds of scrapes and trouble. He's so ham-handed and accident-prone, which is not what you'd expect to find in a Bigfoot. They're usually very acrobatic, agile, graceful, and remarkably intelligent, but not Thumper. I don't know what it is, but he's not 100% right in the head. We enjoyed playing with the twin Bigfoots because they were comical and very funny. Well, at least the smaller one was, as he was sensitive, clever, intelligent, and just lovely to be around. We called him Acorn. Before long, you forgot that they were both covered in hair, as it's pretty much like playing with any other regular kids. But their strength does set them apart from us. We played all kinds of games like ball, tag, hide-and-seek and marbles, and one day we were swimming in the creek together, splashing around for fun, and the tall, ponderous twin lunged towards me, pushing me under the water so forcefully, just as a practical joke. I nearly drowned. I was fighting with all my worth to get back to the surface. I truly thought I was going to die, until Acorn intervened and rescued me, giving Thumper a huge telling off. I got the impression that Thumper had no comprehension of his own strength. It had all been just a game to him. I was always wary of him after that, and he would thump me so hard on my back, very happily when he saw me, with his overlong arm, failing to realise that it really hurt, while his brother would just tap us gently. I think Thumper was really rather dim, because he never ever learnt from his mistakes. Acorn kept apologising to us all the time for Thumper's clod-hopping clumsiness, through his body language and facial expressions, indicating to us that his brother was rather handicapped, or backwards if you like. In his language he told us that Thumper was kabook, which I think means idiot in their speech. I find it rather easy to understand the Bigfoots, for they are quite human and very good at expressing themselves, even with the language barrier between us. But they certainly knew how to pronounce our names, and the names we'd given them. One day as we were playing with stones and aiming them at the different cedar trees to see who was the best shot, unbeknown to us, the twins' mother was secretly watching us from behind a tree. She was quite inquisitive about her younglings' human playmates. I never noticed her, as she hides in plain sight without you even being aware that she's there. The Bigfoots are masterful at becoming one with their environment, just like chameleons. So word of advice, never ever play hide-and-seek with a Bigfoot, as you'll always lose, because you'll never find them. Well, Thumper threw a large stone at the tree where she was hiding as he'd seen her. It was his idea of a joke, but his stone missed the tree and hit her very hard in the head. His mother wasn't amused. She let out a huge painful yelp and came gliding towards Thumper, chattering angrily at him, while he hung his head in shame, for he knew what he'd done. She grabbed him with her overlong arms, shook him for a second, which was possibly like a slap on the wrist to them. She was so mad with him that she completely forgot that we were there. The trouble is that Thumper began to love throwing stones. It became his favourite pastime, although his mother had forbidden him from throwing stones again because he was such a klutz. But he never listened to her reprimands because he was delinquent, wayward, and deliberately naughty. So I said, "How did your foster brother die then?" Well, he was riding his bicycle ahead of me in the woods down one of the bicycle trails, and a stone was thrown at him. I think it was Thumper. He fell off his bicycle and went rolling down the rocky embankment, with his bicycle toppling over the top of him, and his head hit the rocks with a thunderous crack, and it was all over for him. He was dead on the spot. It was quite dreadful, but so quick, I'm glad to say he didn't suffer. Of course, we were completely devastated, and Mrs. Ward, well, she was very upset, of course. She loved Hugh. Well, we all did. Anyway, after Hugh had fallen down the embankment, all of a sudden the female Bigfoot came gliding towards him, and when she saw him lying there dead, she picked him up from the ground and carried him to the flat earth, and then she began to lament, wail, and scream. She beat her chest with her fists. She was terribly distraught, more than I even was. I saw her shaking the tall twin, Thumper, very hard, and showing him the stone as if to say, "Look what you've done." It was very distressing, and both Acorn and Thumper were very upset. I believe the poor Bigfoot mother blamed herself for Thumper's juvenile antics, but it really was an accident. I felt sorry for her. She was so upset. "So you told your foster mother what had happened?" "Of course I did," said Jolene. "But she told me to keep my mouth tightly shut and not to breathe a single word about it to anyone. Hugh's death was obviously ruled an accident by the coroner, and it really was, but indirectly the butter-fingered Thumper was wholly responsible." "So you think I'm in danger?" I asked Jolene. "From Thumper? Is that what you're trying to say?" "Well, yes. I did come to warn you directly about him. I think he's slightly retarded, and if you were to go in the woods he could potentially strike you with a rock, and that is very dangerous because to him it's a game. His mother won't let Thumper play with rocks anymore, but he's so mischievous and inclined to be very disobedient, and that's what bothers me. After the incident, the twins were not allowed to play with me because of what had happened to Hugh, and I really miss them." "I don't need to worry about the other Bigfoots, do I?" I asked Jolene. "No, not at all. They will scare you because they look frightening and very intimidating, of course, but they won't cause you any problems. Well, they shouldn't. They never have to us." After Jolene had left my home, I meditated on what she'd told me for many long days, like a sponge soaking up the water very slowly. It was very difficult to assimilate this information, which I chose initially not to share with my husband. I knew in my gut that it had taken Jolene an enormous amount of courage to tell me all this, so unless she was completely deranged, then her story was likely to be true. I was reluctant to visit the wooded area on our land in case that juvenile Bigfoot thumper was around and was playing with rocks. If these Bigfoots, well, the large ones, were harmless, I hoped with all my heart that after Hugh's tragic death, that the female mother had managed to reveal to Thumper that throwing large stones for fun could result in lethal, devastating consequences. Then, of course, there was the distinct possibility that Thumper might grow out of his juvenile antics. I sincerely hoped so. It was reassuring that the large Bigfoots did not present a problem, but if they were scary and intimidating, then I'd better warn Donovan about them, I thought. It was over dinner one night that I told Donovan that I'd heard we'd had Bigfoots on our property before, who weren't aggressive, but one youngling was inclined to be rather mischievous and appeared to throw stones a lot. My husband began to hoot with laughter, waving his finger at me, saying, "You have a great sense of humour, Emma. You nearly had me hooked. That was a good one." From thenceforth I decided that I'd said more than enough, and that if my husband stumbled across a Bigfoot, he probably wouldn't have a coronary on the spot, because a part of him would be prepared for an erroneous sighting. One day he returned from shopping in the local town. I think he'd picked up some pool supplies for our swimming pool. I noticed he was acting rather strangely. His eyes were so round, and he began to shake as he poured himself a gin and tonic. I'd never seen him behave like that before. "What's got into you?" I asked him. He looked at me with wide, earnest eyes. "I think I saw a Bigfoot," he told me. "Where?" I asked him. "She was about 8 foot tall, I think. Possibly 3 foot wide across the shoulders. And those shoulders were very, very large. I'd say she was about 700 pounds, maybe less. Very, very slender, with a barrel chest, muscular and firm. She looked very human, especially her face, which was very leathery. I think her skin was a tan colour. But my attention was drawn to those deep-set eyes of hers. They were so kind. I knew she wasn't to be feared by then." In a strange way, I felt rather miffed that my husband had had an encounter with Bigfoot, but I wasn't prepared for an encounter all of my own that was to happen a couple of weeks later. I had returned home from my shopping trip at the local town, and the back trunk of my SUV was left wide open, with bags piled on top of each other inside. My cell phone rang. It was my mother, so I began pacing up and down our driveway talking to her, when I suddenly discerned a dark, shadowy figure near the trunk of my car. What was that, I wondered? I had encountered the twins. One little Bigfoot was in my car going through the shopping in an excitable frenzy, rather like a mischievous monkey, tossing anything that it liked towards its brother, who caught it in his wide hands. I noted in his hands he was holding a piece of grapes and a jar of peanut butter. I held my arm up, almost as if I was making a stop sign, rather like a lollipop lady at a pedestrian crossing, and both juvenile Bigfoots obediently stopped in their tracks. They didn't even attempt to run away, which really surprised me. The one critter, who was about 4 foot tall, looked very alarmed. He began swiftly returning my peanut butter and packets of grapes back into their grocery bags, looking rather ridden with guilt. He knew he was in the wrong. While Thumper looked completely mortified to see the foods being replaced into their bags. I guessed immediately that the conscientious twin had to be Acorn. I grabbed a grocery bag, piling it high and very generously with choice foods that they would like, such as peanut butter, grapes, bananas, chips, biscuits, and so much more, which I handed to them. Both twins let out a low-pitched whoop. They were absolutely thrilled. There was no doubt about that in my mind. I think the thing that caught me off guard the most was how remarkably human these Bigfoots were. They looked exactly like kids, only covered in hair, and obviously thicker and stockier, and significantly more muscular, with overlong arms and pyramid-shaped heads. I believe they listened to me because they'd interacted with children before and knew familiar body language signals from humans. So this was my perfect opportunity to get my message across and to explain to them that I never wanted them throwing stones at me. I pointed to the taller juvenile and said, "You thumper," and the creature nodded. And then I turned to the other one and said, "You acorn," and he nodded. I then picked up a large stone, and I used the Bigfoot word for idiot that Jolene had told me, which is kabook. I pointed to the stone and then to Thumper, and I threw the stone across my yard, demonstrating that such an action was kabook. It was extraordinary because these Bigfoots knew exactly what I was saying. An acorn pointed to the stone and to his brother, and I knew he was saying that his brother did not throw stones anymore. Thumper pointed to the stone and to himself and then shook his head. It was clear he was telling me he didn't throw stones. I think he'd learnt his lesson. I knew they understood exactly what I'd been saying. As Jolene informed me, the Bigfoots are never permanently on our land, but I always leave a bag of shopping out for them every week when I've been doing my shopping, and it's always taken by the twins when they're around, and they're not afraid of me. They wave at me as if to say thanks. To date, we've never had any problems with Thumper throwing stones in the woods. Occasionally I see an adult Bigfoot fleeing past us, but these sightings are few and far between, because they are very evasive and elusive creatures. So there you are. That's my story. Well, thank you so much for that fabulous story, and if you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.